Hello and welcome. I'm Goblin, and tonight we are going to be reading ghost stories. Well, they're really just spooky stories, as not really any of them feature ghosts in the traditional sense, but they come from the website Your Ghost Stories, where people post their first-hand paranormal experiences. This website has a lot more to offer than just stories of ghostly sightings and experiences. I've spent a lot of time combing through the archives and finding the strangest and most interesting stories, and I'd like to share a few of them with you now. Once again, the stories I'm about to read were submitted as real, factual accounts experienced by the people who wrote them. Now, you can believe that, or not, whatever you like, but either way, I hope you enjoy a little night around the campfire as we read a few of these stories and discuss some relevant folklore topics in between them. All of these tales tonight will follow the theme haunted hikes, as they all take place on hiking trails or campsites. Why are the woods so spooky to us? Humans are getting further and further away from nature, so it's become somewhere that feels unfamiliar. And the forest at night, well, not only is it pitch black unless you have an artificial light source, it becomes a place teeming with potential danger. Every rustle of leaves, every sound in the dark could be some stealthy predator slinking up to grab you in its jaws. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep. Our first story takes place in the Philippines and is written by username Amor. It's called My Unusual Mountain Guide. I was in college when I joined a mountaineering club. We planned a trip to hike a mountain that's said to be mysterious among locals in a neighboring province where my college was. There were reports of strange lights at night near the peak and sort of partying noises, despite having no power up there. But I just ignored these reports as myths. There were only 2 hikers' trails that were really steep in most parts. It would really be a trouble hauling up a generator. There's also no road for vehicles. Our mission was to scale the mountain within the day. We had no plan to camp overnight. We started the trek very early morning so that we could reach the summit before noon and be in the clear before sundown. We only had a quick lunch up at the top and began descending as soon as we were done eating and getting a bit of a rest. I was the only freshman and everyone else was in their senior year, about to graduate. My buddy was one of a trio of noisy besties, so she would walk with her friends instead of with me and ensuring I was still with the group. I didn't complain, but it stayed that way even during the descent. I was very happy with the view, with all the sense, with the sense of being one with the wilderness. I was awed by everything, fascinated by the sounds and colors, until I realized the sound of chit-chat had grown fainter and farther away. And then I realized I was being left behind. I knew I kept up with the pace and I thought they were just close by because I made sure I could hear them no matter where my attention was, but it was not enough. By then, I was panic-stricken. Even if I quickened my pace, I could not find them anymore. I decided to run faster while descending, and I stumbled, skidded, and tumbled down into a shallow ravine, my face hitting the overgrown roots of trees below. It didn't hurt, but it was quite a shock. I stood up and climbed back up to the trail. I ran again, this time trying to be more careful. I strained, but I could not hear them at all. I was completely alone. Sky began to appear orange. There were birds flying into trees, and the calls grew louder and more diverse. The wind blew cooler air. I felt a bit scared, but I tried being level-headed. I went through a rather wide gap between 2 high walls of red earth. It was long and somewhat winding, like a mini fjord without water. I was still amazed by the sight, but also gnawed with worry. Mixed feelings were not helping, especially when the path ended in 2 forking paths going the opposite direction, although both sloping downwards. I looked, not sure which to take. Panic hit me once more, and I could not focus on the signs to track which path my party must have took. I was in this kind of dilemma when at the end of one of the paths, a white dog appeared. I couldn't see its whole body, but it was looking at me. Then it left. I went after it. I walked on and there were more twists and turns. Every time I hesitated, the dog appeared at the end of each trail, looking at me, as if urging me to follow it. For some reason, I kept running to where it disappeared. I trusted it as a sign. This went on until I could hear my fellow hikers again. They didn't even know I was missing. I had mud all over me, and they just smiled at me and went on with their lives. I couldn't find the dog again for the rest of the hike. I looked back, thanking the white dog who guided me out of the woods in my mind. After this experience, there were more instances when a dog would suddenly appear to guide me, but that's for another story. So that isn't really a scary story and perhaps not even a ghost story, but I found it to be a very interesting story, and it does seem like there was something supernatural afoot. In folklore, it's much more common to encounter beings that want to lead travelers astray rather than guide them back on course. One such example is the will-o'-the-wisp, which is the British name for this spirit, but there are different names and variations across many other cultures. It appears simply as a flickering light, not unlike a firefly or a light from a lantern, which is what many late-night travelers will mistake it for, and follow it into the darkness until they are lost. Another creature known to lead people astray, much the opposite of the white dog in the story, is the Gytrash, also of English folklore. It is seen as a black dog that haunts lonely roads. Luckily, Amor didn't come across one of those, I guess. Getting lost in the woods can be a frightening experience, even without ghosts or otherworldly beings, especially when you aren't familiar with your surroundings. The author of our next story had a similar experience after getting lost on a hike, but what they saw was a bit stranger than a white dog in the distance. This story takes place in Maine, and the author's username is No One Else. It's called What Did I Meet in the Woods? In 1993, I was living in Camden, Maine. I moved there 3 months before from Pennsylvania. It was wonderful. Miles of coastline and forest. Mount Batty was a park in Camden. You could drive the mountain or hike. Look east in the bay, with ships would be in sight. Look north and you could watch the skiers on a slope a half a mile away. Down the road, I was told about trails that you can hike for miles. One winter, being a hiker, I loaded up my dog and got a map and went for a January hike. Snow was in the air, but I couldn't wait. We went. After about 2 hours of following the trail through mountains, it started snowing really hard, almost a whiteout. My dog loved it, and so did I. It was a feeling of magic in the air and the snow. I came across an open field, maybe about 300 feet of open space. My dog became scared and ran in circles, barking. I thought maybe a bear was near. I looked around and could see all around me. No trees, just an open field. My dog started going crazy, and now I'm worried. I started calling for my dog, but she was nowhere in sight. I could hear her barking and running farther away. I spent a couple of minutes looking around the open field, but there was nothing around. I turned to my left, and this man is standing 3 feet away from me. I almost fell over. It was such a shock. Where did this guy come from? I backed off about 5 feet and looked at him. At the time, I was too shocked to think clearly, so I just said, "Where did you come from?" He was over 6 feet and pure white, like a plastic doll. He didn't answer me, so I turned around because I heard my dog again, far away. I turned back a second later, and he was gone. It was snowing like hell all of a sudden, and I started looking this way and that. There was no one there. All there was my footprints in the snow. I started getting out of there. About 20 feet down the trail, I saw footprints alongside my half-snow-covered print. As I walked, there was another 10 feet away, new and fresh. Every 10 feet, another, all going the opposite way. I tried running and jumping to match the strides of these prints, but there was no way I could do it. I'm 6 feet tall and could not match the stride. It was going the way I came in, so I followed it, still hearing my dog. All of a sudden, these footprints disappeared. My old footprints were barely visible due to the falling snow, but I did my best to follow them, to get back out the way I came. When I got back to my truck, my dog was underneath it and did not want to come out. I'm part Native American and heard stories about wood sprites. They can take the shape of people, but look fake if you look close. I think that is what I ran into that day. A week or so later, I went back the same way as before. I never found that open field again, only mountain trails. Spooky story, don't you think? The snow can add an eerie atmosphere to a place, creating a kind of hushness. And of course, a 6-foot-tall silent porcelain man adds some eerie atmosphere as well. What was that being? When I was reading the story, I imagined the tall, white beings from the film Prometheus. There is perhaps a similar creature that haunts the summit of Ben MacDui, which is the second highest mountain in Scotland. At the cold, misty, solitary top of the mountain, a mysterious being is reported by hikers to be heard and seen. It is called the Big Gray Man. Very few have actually seen the creature, though it is described as humanoid, very thin and tall, over 10 feet, with long arms, broad shoulders, and dark skin or hair covering its body. Mostly it is heard, or simply felt. Hikers report hearing their footsteps being echoed, but only one every 3 or so, as if the being they are hearing behind them is taking great strides. A feeling of unease, fear, and an icy coldness is said to come over people when the Gray Man is near. An esteemed hiker and scientist came forward in 1925 with an experience he had on the summit of Ben MacDui, which he recounted as such. Quote, I was returning from the cairn on the summit in a mist when I began to think I heard something else than merely the noise of my own footsteps. Every few steps I took, I heard a crunch and then another crunch, as if someone was walking after me, but taking steps 3 or 4 times the length of my own. I said to myself, this is all nonsense. I listened and heard it again, but could see nothing in the mist. As I walked on and the eerie crunch, crunch sounded behind me, I was seized with terror and took to my heels, staggering blindly among the boulders for 4 or 5 miles, nearly down to the Rothiemurch's forest. Whatever you make of it, I do not know, but there is something very queer about the top of Ben MacDui, and I will not go back there again. End quote. This account inspired several others to come forward with their own very similar experiences on the mountain. The book, The Mammoth Encyclopedia of the Unsolved, by Colin and Damon Wilson, contains many of these accounts of the strange activity on Ben MacDui. One anonymous hiker was dared to spend the night on the summit and awoke in the middle of the night to see, quote, moonlight falling through the opening of his tent. And as he stared at it, he saw a brown blur and knew that something lay between himself and the moon, end quote. Standing in front of the moon, about 20 yards away, was a giant creature around 20 feet tall, covered in brown hair. There are several non-paranormal explanations giving for the seeming visitations of the Big Gray Man of Ben MacDui. Exhaustion from ascending the mountain, isolation if one is alone. Low-frequency sound caused by wind can cause feelings of unease, nervousness, and fear. As far as the sightings of the Big Gray Man go, it could be due to a phenomenon called Brockenspector, which basically translates to mountain ghost. It's caused when a shadow of a person is cast onto fog or mist. The person's shadow basically appears as a large black humanoid shape with long legs. Looking at an example of a Brockenspector, you could see how it fits the description of the Big Gray Man. and perhaps the conditions one is under after a long, lonely, cold hiking expedition. Witnessing this natural phenomenon could appear as a giant, menacing creature. I find both the legends and the possible explanations equally fascinating. But whatever the creature was in our story, it seemed to be harmless and helpful, leading the author in the direction of their car. Another interesting detail to the story was that the author mentioned that this field where they encountered the creature did not seem to exist when they revisited the trail. They actually restate this in the comments section. Quote, "When I went back, I followed the same trail as before. I saw landmarks, and even though I was sure it was the same way, I could not find a field. It struck me as strange to have a flat, open field on a trail like that after giving it a little thought. I don't think I want to run into something like that again, though. From what I know, it can be a good or a bad omen, and one should never look for it." End quote. Perhaps they stumbled upon a thin place on their hike as the snowstorm rolled in. A place that is accessible to humans only under the right conditions. With that, let's read the next story. It is written by user Arctic Piggy and takes place in Italy. It's called Forest Encounter. My grandparents used to rent a house in a little mountain village for 3 months in the summer. I used to go there every summer from the ages of 5 to 14 with my older sister and my younger cousin. I really liked my time there, and as I grew older, this passion for the mountains stuck with me. I am now 26, and every summer I go hiking with my boyfriend. The trails we are used to hiking are sometimes very steep, and it's just the two of us, surrounded by the mountain and the silence that covers everything. Sometimes we even camp halfway if the climb is too long. One day we were climbing a difficult trail near a lake in Italy. I finished first, so I was waiting for my boyfriend at the end of the path, at the top of that mountain. It was beautiful there. Butterflies flew on the flowers around me, and birds were chirping happily. I could see the whole lake surrounded by the forest. I like to sit in the silence of the mountain and watch the stunning view of the lake, and watch the animals around me living their lives. It's relaxing. I was sitting there on a rock, and I don't know how, but I felt something was in the woods behind me. Behind me there was a precipice. I stood up and tried to see if there was something down there. That's when I saw it. I still get shivers when I think about it. Deep down there was a chamois, a beautiful one with long horns. I got excited because I rarely see one. I was looking at him from behind. His fur was light brown and he had a black line that went from the neck to the tail. But something was very wrong with it. That's when I froze. His front legs looked like they didn't end with a normal cloven hoof, but he had 3 fingers at the end of his front legs, similar to a bird claw, but not as sharp. The back legs seemed normal. I could see it because he was walking very slowly and calmly through the vegetation. Then I noticed with great horror that his face seemed flat, no muzzle. I couldn't look at him directly in the face, but I couldn't see his forehead and nose. What should have been there just wasn't. Thinking about it now, I really wished I had seen his face, just to see how the eyes and mouth were organized. He disappeared into the pine's shadow, and I was still there, shocked when my boyfriend finally arrived. I told him what I saw and he didn't believe me. He laughed. I know it's not scary, and it can even be funny if you think about it, a chamois with eagle's legs and a flat face. I thought about it the whole time we were descending. It was so weird. At the end, I told myself that I must have dreamed it, even though I would love to know that I wasn't the only one to see that thing. There wasn't any village at the foot of the mountain, so I couldn't ask if someone saw that too, or if someone knew anything about a weird animal living in the forest. I like to think it was a deity that took the form of a chamois. For those who are unfamiliar, like I was, a chamois is a type of antelope/goat that is native to Europe and dwells in high mountains. This story instantly struck a chord with me, not only because of the mystical and strange qualities to it, but because it reminded me of one of my favorite films, Princess Mononoke. The description of this animal in the story sounds remarkably like a creature in the movie called the Forest Spirit, an ancient and powerful god of the forest. It appears, in daylight, as a large deer with eagle feet and a flat, human-like face. Even the way the author describes the chamois moving slowly through the vegetation resembles a scene in the movie. I have to think she isn't aware of this movie since she didn't mention it. She does say in the comments that she has, quote, read about Japanese deities that live in forests and have a flat human face, end quote. Her account seems so earnest that I want to give her the benefit of the doubt that she's being truthful about this encounter. And I want to believe in magical forest spirits, okay? Speaking of strange creatures in the forest, let's now read our last story of the night. It's from Sweden, written by user Cloudy, and it's called Not Only Folklore. I grew up on a farm in a very rural area, basically in the deep forests of northern Sweden. I've always been very close to nature and spiritualism, even though I have lived in huge cities for years now and not really been in touch with Sweden or nature. I've had quite a lot of strange, unexplainable things happen to me over the years, and I've never doubted that there are ghosts and spirits. I find it easy to discuss the paranormal with pretty much anyone. However, the story I'm about to share is different for me, and it's not really something I've discussed with anyone before. The reason I feel it's finally time to share it is that I've come across quite a few similar stories on this forum. My dad is this super macho hunter guy. Basically, all my memories of him are from us hunting, fishing, camping, tracking, etc. He taught me everything about surviving in the wild. This story takes place on a camping trip. Myself, who's about 6 years old at the time, my dad, my 2 older sisters, and our dog. Being such a young age, there are loads of details that I do not remember, but the parts I do remember, I remember clearly. We set up our tents on the top of a mountain, near a lake deep in the forest. The day was as brilliant as only childhood memories can be. We were playing all day, laughing, running, making up stories, scrubbing our knees while exploring the forest. We saw leeches in the water near the shore, but didn't care and jumped in anyway. In the evening, we had the fire going, grilling hot dogs on sticks. We went to sleep, and my dad, I've always found this really weird as I don't know how he was able to sleep like this, but also so very nice. My dad, as always, lay down on his back with his arms wide open to allow all 3 of us to sleep with them as a pillow. Me and my sister shared one of the arms, while my other sister was on the other side with the dog, sleeping by her feet. I don't know why, but even after my dad had been telling us multiple stories and fell asleep himself, I was unable to do so. I was listening to the forest. It was still awake too. There were no people except for us for miles and miles. I wasn't scared, as there isn't anything I love more than being in a Swedish forest. Suddenly, the dog is awake and listening to something too. Being a hunting dog, she's clearly marking something right outside the door. When the zipper of the tent slowly starts to open, I can see that she's frightened. I get scared too and try to wake up my sister. The dog backs up, standing near my sister's head and staring intensely at the door, although she stays perfectly quiet, and I think this is what urges me to stay quiet too. I do not dare to move and try to discreetly push my sister awake whilst whispering her name repeatedly. She doesn't wake up, and the door is now fully open. What I saw standing there was the strangest thing I ever saw. This little creature, short enough to stand tall in the door without bending over. Usually you'd have to crawl into such a small tent. I know it sounds weird, but the best way I can describe it is that it looked like a little devil, such a thing you might see in a cartoon. His face was sort of lumpy and red. He had black hair, but the thing I remember most is the expression he had on his face. I pretended to sleep and had my eyes almost shut. He sort of looked around the tent with this weirded out look in his eyes, as if he just wanted to check out who we were and what we were doing there. He simply looked around, seemed satisfied with that, and zipped closed the tent again. The dog settled down shortly after, and I managed to wake my sister, who told me that it was just a dream. I know for sure it wasn't, and I remember it so clearly still. I believe the author when they say that there's nothing better than a Swedish forest. I hope that's something I get to experience one day. I have no idea what this creature could have been. The author does mention that Nordic folklore has many creatures that may fit, but they aren't sure of which creature this may have been. And indeed, Nordic folklore is one of my favorites because of its extensive catalogs of beings that reinforce the cultural respect and appreciation for nature, whether it be mountains, forests, or caves. There are trolls, elves, gnomes, giants, and dozens of other creatures in Nordic folklore, but I'm not aware of any that particularly fit the description of the one in the story, although I'm certainly no expert. The description sounds like an imp, which are creatures that originate from Germanic legends, and Sweden is a country of Germanic ancestry. Imps are generally small and appear humanoid, but are often depicted with horns on their head and long tails. They aren't usually outright malicious or harmful, more just mischievous. The creature in the story didn't seem to make any attempts to do any harm to the author and her family, although maybe it was deterred by something. The dog, perhaps. Mostly it just seemed curious. Maybe it was some sort of nature spirit, tied to the forest in some way. The word imp does originally come from an Old English word relating to trees. Honestly, I found the imagery of the little creature stepping inside the tent and just kind of peering around to be pretty cute. I'm not sure what reaction I would have had if I had actually experienced it, but the whole story was generally very charming and magical. In fact, I'd say on the whole, the stories tonight were generally magical. No one was really threatened or frightened, but that's not necessarily what I'm going for when I seek out these stories. The stories that I find to be the most compelling are the ones that are unusual. And if indeed these stories are true, as they are claimed to be, I'd say all these people saw some pretty unusual things on their routine trip to the woods. Nature is far older than the human race. Trees can be hundreds of years old, mountains billions. Who are we to say what does or doesn't exist within the realm of nature? If you walk into the forest with an open mind, who knows what you might find? Until next time.